In today's video, we're taking a look back at the Oliver Ekman-Larsson trade rumors and if anything further could come from that. Plus, we have some latest free agent updates talking about players like Athanasiou, Sheary, Hammond, Haula, and others. And we have some pretty strong comments from one of the top agents regarding the NHLPA stance on their situation with the owners wanting them to defer more salary. We'll discuss all the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, today we want to revisit here a few things. First up, I want to take a look at some free agent rumors from around the NHL. There's still a lot of key players out there with no contracts, and we're likely going to see some flurry of contract signings, I would suspect, once they get everything hammered out and get ready to start a season, once we know when training camps are going to be and everything like that. Now, obviously, one thing I want to talk about is an article here from JJ Reagan talking about the Washington Capitals, suggesting they could be a team dipping into free agency to add a little bit more depth on the wing. They could also promote from within, and they have to decide what they want to do in that regard. Now, of course, they're suggesting that the only real option to promote from within to kind of get somebody maybe looking for a third-line winger would probably be a guy like Daniel Sprong, who may be able to accept that kind of opportunity and excel with it. They could get the young winger who had a great junior career, but has struggled to find consistency so far in the NHL with a few different teams, that opportunity. But some players that they could be looking at through free agency would include the speedy winger like Andreas Athanasiou, also Connor Sheary, who they're quite familiar with from playing a lot in Pittsburgh, so obviously a player they've played against a substantial amount of time. You could also be looking at a guy like Melker Karlsson. They're all kind of different players. It kind of depends on what attributes they really want to add to that line, really heading into the NHL season here. But the Capitals are a team looking to add some depth, and those are the top free agents that they're apparently kind of exploring options and deciding how they need to address that situation. Now, looking at some other free agents and some potential landing spots for them, I've come across a few articles here talking about some free agent predictions, and some of these I thought made somewhat good sense. For example, the most likely landing spot that the general consensus I've seen is mentioned a few places for defenseman Travis Hamonic would be the Winnipeg Jets. Obviously, he prefers to stay in the Western Conference. He's a pretty solid right shot D, who's good in his own end. The Jets could certainly add another blue liner with experience back there. It doesn't look like he's really going to have a chance to return to the Calgary Flames. Of course, Travis Hamonic was one of the few players as well who opted not to go to the NHL bubble for the 1920 NHL playoffs to complete that season. I kind of mentioned before, I can't really say with any kind of certainty, just speculation on my part, the fact that he does not have a contract yet. I wonder if that's kind of impacting teams offering him a contract or not, especially with the uncertainty of how everything is going to work out for the 2020-21 season. I don't know exactly, but obviously Hamonic, I think, would be a guy who could offer some good value to the Jets, and it would make a good amount of sense from both him and the team's perspective. And another free agent who could find himself with a contract soon would be Erik Haula. Now, Haula's a player who battled a lot of injuries in the past year or so, but obviously a guy who could be a pretty solid number 3 center on a lot of teams. Could certainly add a fair bit of depth for a lot of teams looking to add down the middle to like a number 2, number 3 center. And the one team that comes to mind that I've seen mentioned that makes sense as well would be a team like the San Jose Sharks. So obviously they're not bringing back Captain Joe Thornton, so they are going to have some holes down the middle, and he could be a player who could slide in there and possibly a good little offensive juggernaut for them. He's had some good offensive numbers, especially during his time in Vegas. Obviously, like I said, between his time in Carolina and Florida, somewhat injury filled, so he hasn't really had a ton of success there. But if he can recapture what he did, especially that first year in Vegas, he could be a great fit in San Jose. And I do expect all these guys to get signed, just a matter of where they end up. And obviously, like I said, I expect a flurry of signings to take place once we have more details on the season. Now, speaking of the season, one of the top agents in the NHL, Alan Walsh, who's really outspoken. He's a guy who represents Marc-Andre Fleury, for example, who put up that picture on social media with the big sword going through Fleury that had DeBoer on it, insinuating that DeBoer was stabbing Fleury in the back. He's not afraid to speak his mind, as we know. Very outspoken, but well respected amongst NHL players as being one of the top agents to really fight for his guys to get what he feels they want and deserve. And he's basically said that at this point, the NHL players should not have to give anything back. He's outlined the fact that the NHL and the PA, when they hammered out the CBA and the Memorandum of Understanding, that they went through all kinds of projections of what 2021 was going to look like, including some worst-case scenarios. So that it's basically the owners and Gary Bettman wanting a bit of a do-over here, and that it's not something the players should accept, and they really shouldn't have to feel like they have a gun to their head in order to play and make money this year. Obviously, Walsh, like I said, he's not afraid to speak his mind, and I understand from that perspective here. If they really did have all those projections ironed out ahead of time, then I really don't like the idea of the owners going back here already. Now, I also understand from a business side of things that things can change, and they can change rather quickly. Like everything to do with this pandemic, things can change in a couple of days, a week. Like it can be drastically different. But still, if they've already hammered out what they felt were worst case scenarios and the payment deferrals and the escrow numbers that were already worked out, this is not a good look for the ownership group. I understand they're losing money, but still, you got to hold up your end of the bargain here. And at the end of the day, the players are not going to likely feel too pressured to accept this. But at the same time, they want to play. The owners want to play. Well, they got to get something together here and come up with a solution. So we'll see. But I must say, Alan Walsh makes a lot of good points. And we'll see if more people on the player side of things are willing to be more outspoken and get their points out there, hopefully maybe to kind of move things along. I mean, we'll see if Bettman and the owners don't often feel pressured to do things. So be interesting to see what kind of response we get from the players' pushback against their requests. Now, as I mentioned as well, I want to talk about Oliver Ekman-Larsson. Of course, he's returned to Arizona. Is expected to start some informal skates with some teammates in the area while they wait for news on NHL training camp. And he's been interviewed and asked about all the trade rumors that kind of encompassed him and his offseason to do with going to possibly Vancouver or to Boston. Essentially, we get a little bit more details there as to why those teams were the ones selected and if they could be revisited. And ultimately, if he had any kind of resentment or hard feelings towards the new GM there, Bill Armstrong, who had to handle the situation pretty much immediately upon given the job. He said he selected Boston because he has obviously played a year in Portland, Maine, before being full-time in the NHL during the lockout year, and he really was in Boston quite a bit, spent a lot of time there, really liked the city, and obviously knows that the team has been, on a good path and a lot of good success and historic franchise, so that's kind of what led him to select Boston as being one of the few teams he would accept a move to. And the main reason for Vancouver was he's had a lot of Swedish friends play there, and had a lot of great things to say about the city of Vancouver. And of course sees them as a young up-and-coming team with another top Swedish player like Elias Pettersson as well, who he'd love to play with. So obviously, a lot of Swedish history in Vancouver that made things interesting and appealing for him to consider that. But obviously with his self-imposed deadline come and gone, you have to wonder, is this really over, and will either of these teams possibly make a comeback here to see if they can reignite trade talks? I get the impression during all the information that was given out about the whole situation that the Canucks were way more interested than the Bruins, but I think in all honesty, looking at their blue lines and how things have changed throughout the offseason, I think the Bruins might be the team who actually could use him more so. I mean, Ekman-Larsson would be a good fit in Vancouver too, but I think with the losses in Vancouver, especially if Chara doesn't come back and they've already lost Krug, there's some big holes there, and obviously he would have the experience to get that done. So I wonder if there's a situation that could arise where a team like Boston, who has been rumored to wanting to make a big splash but really hasn't done much this offseason, and I know I've seen many reports from Boston media saying even if they bring back Chara and even if they re-sign Jake DeBrusk, which is expected at some point, that it's not enough. Like, this team did not have a great playoff last year, and by not making changes, it kind of sends a message that that's okay, and this franchise and this fan base obviously expects a lot. So clearly they want to see some kind of an upgrade to make this team better than before, especially with a lot of guys like Krejci and Rask, etc. entering their final year of their contract. There's likely going to be a very different looking team in a year or two, and the fans expect something, significant to give them another push to win with this group. So Ekman-Larsson did acknowledge that, maybe he would be asked about this again in the future, and he'd have to consider that at the time. But it sounds to me like I don't think anything's really going to change with him. If he feels that the team really wants to move him, and they have a variety of reasons for doing so, that he's willing to work with them, but these are pretty much the only destinations he's willing to accept. He signed a long-term contract. He said he was happy to be back in Arizona. He's happy he wasn't traded. He's glad to stay. Wouldn't have signed a long-term contract if he didn't want to be there, which is all the right things to do, and I certainly understand that. But I can't help but wonder, obviously from Bill Armstrong's standpoint, from the interviews I've heard of him, especially where he was on a few podcasts doing some interviews, he kind of made it sound like when he was first hired that it was Ekman-Larsson's agent that kind of contacted him and said right away that they needed to talk and figure something out. So that says that maybe, even though Ekman-Larsson's saying all the same things, I can't help but wonder if he might be more willing to move than he's letting on, which I would not expect him to come out publicly and admit anyway. Obviously, it's rare that players come out and do that unless things get really, bad with the relationship with the team. So we'll see what happens, but if a team like Boston comes back and makes a strong pitch, which they've really yet to do in my opinion, I would not be surprised to see this, revisit it. But at the same time, it could also not be surprising if things settle down, he plays the season, and it'd be curious to see if they do revisit this in the future. So let me know your thoughts. Do you see Ekman-Larsson being a long-term member of the Coyotes, or do you see the team or the player wanting to revisit this sooner than later? And if a team like Boston or Vancouver will finally come through with a proper offer to facilitate a trade. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.